Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive with us.
It's great to be back.
Today, we're going to be exploring regionalism. And this is something that's particularly relevant, I think, for those of you who are prepping for the UPSC International Relations paper.
Absolutely.
But even if you're not exam-bound, this is a topic that's, I think, fascinating for anyone who wants to understand global dynamics.
Sure.
We tend to think of regionalism as like, countries teaming up based on geography, right?
Right.
Like they're close to each other. They decide to kind of, create a group.
Yeah, makes sense.
But as you'll discover, it's way more complex and even contradictory than just, drawing lines on a map.
Yeah, it's intriguing. What's really intriguing is that regionalism operates on multiple levels.
Okay.
It's not just about international relations. It actually shapes our understanding of the world, even at local levels.
I find that interesting. Could you elaborate on that a bit? I'm
Yeah.
sure our listeners would find a few examples helpful here.
Absolutely. Let's start with something familiar like subnational regionalism. So think about states within the U.S.,
Right.
each with its own identity and governance, but united under a federal system.
Yeah.
It's like a microcosm of regionalism playing out on a smaller scale.
Ah, so it's like those mini regions forming a bigger region, like a set of nesting dolls.
Exactly.
But how does that then relate to global politics?
That same principle scales up to the international level.
Okay.
Countries form transnational regions like the EU or ASEAN,
Right.
driven by shared interests and goals. These collaborations go beyond simple geographical proximity. And for our UPSC aspirants out there, it's worth noting that not all countries are part of such blocs.
Oh, interesting.
Mongolia, for instance, stands out by not being a part of any regional trade agreements as of 2005.
Huh.
This raises questions about the benefits and drawbacks of participating in such arrangements.
Okay, so it's already getting complex.
Yeah.
And, you mentioned the U.S., and that's a fascinating example because it itself emerged from regionalism,
Yeah.
right? It evolved from colonies to a confederation and finally the federal state we know today.
Precisely. And that historical evolution underscores a key point. Regions are not static.
Okay.
They're dynamic and constantly reshaped by political and economic forces. What we consider a region today might have looked very different a century ago,
Right.
and it will likely continue to evolve.
Yeah, that's a good point. Especially, for UPSC folks who need to analyze trends. This makes me think about situations where regional identities transcend national borders. Take the Kurds, for example. Spread across several countries in the Middle East, they have a strong sense of regional identity that defies traditional political boundaries.
Excellent example. Or even consider the close ties between San Diego, California and Tijuana, Mexico.
Yeah.
That economic and social interconnectedness creates a micro-region that exists within and alongside the larger North American context of NAFTA.
Right.
So just as we see with the Kurds, regional dynamics can be complex and multi-layered.
Okay, so region clearly isn't as simple as it seems. It's more about relationships, shared interests, and evolving identities than just lines on a map. It's almost as if countries decide to build a personality together as a group. But if that's the case, how do we even define what a region is in the first place?
That's the million-dollar question. The obvious answer is geography. Continents, for example, seem like natural regions.
Right, continents seem like the most intuitive way to divide the world into regions.
Yeah.
But if we look closer, are they really the defining factor?
Not always. Many regional groups are subcontinental like ASEAN or even transcontinental like
Yeah.
NATO or APEC.
Okay.
Geography plays a role, but it's not the whole story.
So what other factors come into play when defining a region? Does shared culture play a role, like a common language or religion?
Shared culture can be a powerful force.
Okay.
Think about the Arab League, unified by language and religion, or
Right.
the Nordic Council with shared history and values. Even the EU, primarily an economic alliance, emphasizes shared democratic ideals. So cultural affinity can definitely be a factor.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But then you have groups like ASEAN, formed for economic cooperation despite significant cultural differences and even past conflicts between members.
Right.
So it seems like practical considerations, especially economic ones, can sometimes trump cultural ties.
You've hit on a crucial point. Regionalism isn't always about shared history or cultural harmony. Often it's driven by pragmatic considerations, particularly economic benefits. The desire for increased trade access to markets and economic stability can be powerful motivators for countries to band together, even if they have different cultural backgrounds or historical baggage. A good example of this is
Yeah, what's a good example of that?
Mexico.
Mexico.
Okay, it's a fascinating case study because it straddles multiple regional identities.
Okay.
It's part of North America through NAFTA,
Good.
Central America historically,
Okay.
Latin America culturally,
Hmm.
and even part of the Asia-Pacific region through APEC.
Wow, talk about an identity crisis.
Hmm.
That really highlights how fluid and multifaceted regions can be. They're not fixed entities, but constantly adapting to changing global dynamics. It's like they have their own personalities that shift and evolve.
That's a great way to put it. And it leads us to a concept that might surprise some listeners. Regions, like nations, can be considered imagined communities,
Yeah.
a term coined by Benedict Anderson.
Okay.
They're not naturally occurring phenomena, but social constructs that we create and reinforce through shared narratives, institutions, and interactions.
Okay, hold on. If regions are imagined, does that make them any less real? I mean, I can point to a map and see the borders of a country,
Hmm.
but how do you define the boundaries of something that's essentially an idea?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of the matter. While they might be based on shared ideas and perceptions, their impact is undeniable. They shape economic policies, influence security alliances, and even affect cultural exchange. However, recognizing their constructed nature helps us understand why regional identities are often contested. Different groups may have competing visions of what a region should be, adding a layer of complexity to global relations.
This is really making me rethink my whole understanding of regions. It's fascinating and a bit mind-boggling to think of them as fluid, evolving concepts, almost like living organisms adapting to their environment.
Huh.
I can see how this would be crucial for UPSC aspirants to grasp, as it goes beyond rote memorization and requires deeper analysis of the forces shaping global dynamics.
Absolutely. And within that dynamic landscape, we see different flavors of regionalism emerge, each with its own set of motivations and objectives.
Okay. I'm curious to learn more about those different types of regionalism. It seems like there's more to it than just countries being geographically close to each other. What are some of the main categories?
Well, one prominent type is economic regionalism.
Okay.
This has been particularly dominant since the 1990s with the rise of free trade areas, customs unions, and common markets. It's all about reducing trade barriers and boosting economic cooperation between member states. Interestingly, even the WTO, which generally promotes global free trade, allows these regional agreements as exceptions to its most favored nation principle.
Oh, interesting. Perhaps we should unpack that principle for our listeners.
Yeah, let's do that.
It's a term we hear a lot, but I'm not sure everyone fully understands what it means in practice. Can you break it down for us?
Of course. The most favored nation principle essentially means that WTO members must treat all trading partners equally.
Okay.
So you can't offer better trade terms to one country without offering the same to all other WTO members. However, regional trade agreements are an exception to this rule. They allow countries within a specific region to give each other preferential treatment, creating a kind of inner circle for trade.
Ah, so it's like having a VIP section in the Global Trade Club. But how does that impact the overall balance of trade? Does it create unfair advantages for some countries while disadvantaging others?
It's a complex issue, and there's a lot of debate about the impact of regional trade agreements. Some argue that they can distort global trade flows and create unfair competition. Others contend that they can actually stimulate overall trade by lowering barriers and making it easier for businesses to operate across borders. The key takeaway here is that regional economic blocs have become a major force in the global economy. And understanding their interplay with the WTO is crucial for navigating international trade relations.
That makes a lot of sense. So we've got economic regionalism covered. What about security? Do regions play a role in how countries protect themselves?
Absolutely. That's where security regionalism comes in.
Okay.
It's all about countries cooperating to address shared security threats and maintain stability within a particular region. A classic example is the European Union.
Right.
One of the driving forces behind its formation was to prevent future wars between France and Germany.
Yeah.
The idea was that by creating strong economic ties, war would become unthinkable. They formed what's called a security community.
So it's like, let's be friends and trade together instead of fighting.
Mm-hmm.
But can economic ties really prevent conflict? History seems to show that countries can still go to war even when they have strong trade relations.
You're right to be skeptical. Economic interdependence doesn't guarantee peace, but it can certainly make conflict less appealing. The idea behind a security community is that the cost of conflict becomes so high, both economically and socially, that it acts as a deterrent. This can be reinforced by shared institutions like a regional court or parliament that promote dialogue and cooperation. The EU, for example, has a long history of mediating disputes between member states.
So it's not just about economics, but also about building trust and mechanisms for peaceful conflict resolution.
Yeah.
But is this concept of a security community still relevant in today's world, where security threats are often transnational, like terrorism or cyber attacks?
That's a great question, and it highlights how security regionalism has evolved. While preventing interstate conflict remains a priority, regional organizations are also increasingly involved in addressing transnational threats. We see this in the development of regional counterterrorism initiatives, intelligence sharing networks, and even joint military exercises.
So it's like regions are becoming mini United Nations and taking on peacekeeping roles within their own neighborhoods.
Exactly.
That's pretty impressive. But what are some concrete examples of this type of regional security cooperation?
Well, we see it in various parts of the world. For instance,
Yeah.
Asia-Pacific countries have collaborated on peacekeeping missions in Cambodia and East Timor.
Right.
ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, has intervened in conflicts within West Africa, like in Liberia. These regional organizations can be nimble and effective in addressing specific security challenges, often with a deeper understanding of local contexts than global institutions like the UN.
This is all making a lot of sense now. So we've got economic regionalism, which is all about trade and economic cooperation, and security regionalism, which focuses on preventing conflict and addressing shared security threats. What's the third flavor of regionalism you mentioned earlier?
That would be political regionalism. It's less about tangible things like trade deals or military cooperation, and more about countries coming together to promote shared values, boost their international image, and gain a stronger voice on the world stage.
Okay.
Think of it as a way for countries to amplify their influence in global affairs by acting as a unified bloc.
So it's kind of like a regional PR campaign? Countries teaming up to project a united front and push for their interests on the global stage?
There's definitely an element of that. It's about shaping perceptions and leveraging collective clout to achieve shared political goals. For instance, the Council of Europe focuses on promoting human rights and democracy across the continent.
Okay.
The Arab League aims to advance the interests of Arab countries on issues of common concern. And the Organization of African Unity, later transformed into the African Union, was founded to promote solidarity and cooperation among African nations and to eradicate colonialism.
These are great examples. So it's less about tangible agreements and more about projecting a unified political identity and amplifying their influence in global forums. But do these neat categories always hold up in the real world? Don't most regional groups have a mix of economic security and political goals?
You're absolutely right. In practice, the lines often blur. And there's no better example of this than the African Union.
That's interesting. I know the African Union has been increasingly active in recent years, but I'm not very familiar with its structure and how it operates. Can you tell us more about it?
Of course, the African Union is a fascinating case study
Yeah.
because it embodies this blending of different regionalism types. At its core, it's a political body with a Pan-African parliament and court of justice.
But it's not just about speeches and legal rulings, right? I've heard they are also involved in a wide range of other activities.
You're right. The AU isn't just a talking shop. It's actively involved in promoting economic integration within subregions, tackling development challenges like fighting AIDS, and even intervening militarily in conflicts like the one in Darfur.
So it's like a multi-tool of regionalism,
Yeah,
tackling everything from trade to peacekeeping to public health.
precisely.
That's a very ambitious agenda.
The AU exemplifies how dynamic and interconnected regionalism can be. It's not about fitting neatly into a single category, but responding to the complex and ever-changing needs of its members. This multifaceted approach presents both challenges and opportunities, making it a compelling case study for understanding the evolving nature of regional cooperation in the 21st century.
Wow, this deep dive is really living up to its name. We started with what seemed like a straightforward concept, regions, and have uncovered a whole world of shifting identities, competing interests, and remarkable cooperation. This is definitely essential knowledge for UPSC aspirants.
Yeah,
But even for those just interested in understanding the world around them, this is eye-opening stuff.
I agree. Regionalism is a lens through which we can understand global power shifts, economic trends, and even cultural exchange. It's a story that's still being written, and we're all part of it.
And speaking of stories being written, we've been talking a lot about how regions are imagined communities. This has me thinking. If regions are imagined communities, does that make them any less real or impactful than nations?
That's a fascinating question, and one that scholars and policymakers grapple with constantly. You're right that nations have those tangible markers of sovereignty.
Right, like passports.
Exactly. But as we've discussed, regional groups can wield considerable economic and even military power. The EU, for instance, has a single currency, a parliament, a court of justice, and is developing its own defense capabilities.
So are we witnessing a shift in global power dynamics then? Are regions becoming the new power players on the world stage, challenging the traditional dominance of nation-states?
It's a possibility. We're in a period of transition, where the relationship between nation-states and regional blocs is evolving. Some argue that regionalism strengthens the international system by creating more avenues for cooperation and problem solving. Others worry that it could lead to fragmentation and undermine global institutions like the UN. The reality is probably somewhere in between.
This is definitely a lot to think about. For our UPSC aspirants, I can see how understanding these nuances is crucial for analyzing international relations and forming informed opinions. It's not just about memorizing the names of regional organizations, but about grasping the underlying dynamics and potential future trajectories.
Absolutely. Pay attention to the different types of regionalism, the motivations behind them, and the key examples from around the world. Think critically about the challenges and opportunities presented by regional integration. And don't forget the contested nature of regional identities.
Hmm.
Exam questions might ask you to analyze different perspectives on a particular region's formation or future trajectory.
All right, UPSC gurus, take note. This is prime exam material. But honestly, even if you're not studying for the UPSC, this stuff is fascinating, right? It touches on so many aspects of our world: economics, politics, security, culture.
It certainly does. Regionalism is a lens through which we can understand the complexities of globalization and the evolving relationships between countries. It's a story that's still unfolding, and we're all participants in shaping its future.
Well said. So whether you're a future diplomat, a curious citizen, or just someone who loves a good deep dive, we hope you've enjoyed this exploration of regionalism. It's a topic that's both complex and constantly evolving. So stay curious and keep learning.
And remember, the world is full of regions waiting to be explored both literally and intellectually. So keep those passports handy and those minds open.
And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into fascinating topics. We're here to make learning fun, engaging, and maybe even a little bit mind-blowing. Until next time, keep exploring. If regions are these imagined communities, does that make them any less real or impactful than nations? I mean, nations have clearly defined borders, passports, armies, regions seem much more fluid and abstract.
That's a fascinating question, and one that scholars and policymakers grapple with constantly. You're right that nations have those tangible markers of sovereignty, but as we've discussed, regional groups can wield considerable economic and even military power. The EU, for instance, has a single currency, a parliament, a court of justice, and is developing its own defense capabilities.
So are we witnessing a shift in global power dynamics then? Are regions becoming the new power players on the world stage, challenging the traditional dominance of nation states? What does this mean for the future of global governance?
These are questions without easy answers. We're in a period of transition where the relationship between nation-states and regional blocs is evolving. Some argue that regionalism strengthens the international system by creating more avenues for cooperation and problem-solving.
Huh?
Others worry that it could lead to fragmentation and undermine global institutions like the UN. The reality is probably somewhere in between.
This is definitely a lot to think about for our UPSC aspirants. I can see how understanding these nuances is crucial for analyzing international relations and forming informed opinions. It's not just about memorizing the names of regional organizations, but about grasping the underlying dynamics and potential future trajectories.
Absolutely. Pay attention to the different types of regionalism, the motivations behind them, and the key examples from around the world. Think critically about the challenges and opportunities presented by regional integration. And don't forget the contested nature of regional identities. Exam questions might ask you to analyze different perspectives on a particular region's formation or future trajectory.
All right, UPSC gurus, take note. This is prime exam material. But honestly, even if you're not studying for the UPSC, this stuff is fascinating, right? It touches on so many aspects of our world economics, politics, security, culture.
It certainly does. Regionalism is a lens through which we can understand the complexities of globalization and the evolving relationships between countries. It's a story that's still unfolding, and we're all participants in shaping its future.
Well said. So whether you're a future diplomat, a curious citizen, or just someone who loves a good deep dive, we hope you've enjoyed this exploration of regionalism. It's a topic that's both complex and constantly evolving. So stay curious and keep learning.
And remember, the world is full of regions waiting to be explored both literally and intellectually, so keep those passports handy and those minds open.
Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into fascinating topics. We're here to make learning fun, engaging, and maybe even a little bit mind-blowing. Until next time, keep exploring.